Part 1: The Return. The night he returned, the air was thick with the scent of rain, and the Carter estate was shrouded in an unsettling stillness. Ethan Carter stepped out of his military jeep, his sharp eyes scanning the mansion he had always considered home. He had been away on a mission for only a short while, but something in the air felt off. As he walked into the grand hall, expecting the usual eager welcome, the silence greeted him instead. No familiar footsteps running toward him, a warm embrace or feigned weakness to draw his attention. He frowned. Where was she? Then he saw her. Emily stood at the foot of the stairs, her posture straight, her hands neatly folded in front of her. But something was different. She wore a faded school uniform that covered her completely, a stark contrast to the stylish, revealing outfits she used to parade around in. Her expression was calm, too calm. She did not rush to him, did not pretend to feel unwell just to gain his sympathy. And then she spoke. "Welcome back, Uncle." Ethan froze. The word uncle rang in his ears like a death knell. It was the first time she had ever called him that. For years, she had clung to him, refused to acknowledge the formal title, insisted on treating him as something more. But now, she stood there, detached and distant, as if he were nothing more than a stranger. His brow furrowed as he studied her, searching for an explanation, a sign of mischief, an act. But there was none. Had she truly gone? Ged? I had waited for this moment. For his return. For the moment I could finally let go. In my past life, I had loved Ethan Carter beyond reason. I had abandoned my own dreams, molded myself into the woman I thought he wanted. I had spent decades by his side, only to be met with a cruel reality: his heart had never truly belonged to me. On the day of his death, I had found a photograph in his hand. A photo of his first love, Olivia Jennings, with a message scrawled on the back: "The love of my life for 50 years. That was the moment my heart shattered. But this time, thin. GS would be different. This time, I would not waste my life chasing a man who had never wanted me. This time, I would carve my own path. And it started now, with my admission to the first military medical university, the place where my true destiny lay. The thick envelope in my hands was proof of my new beginning. I instinctively hid it behind my back as I stepped forward, past Ethan, toward the main hall. That was when I saw her. Olivia Jennings. She was there, standing beside him, her delicate hands arranging some gifts she had brought from the city. She glanced at me, a slow smile curving her lips as if she had already won. "This fine silk fabric is a gift for Aunt Helen. Didn't you mention she wanted something elegant for fall?" she purred, her voice as sweet as honey. "And these opera records, I had a colleague find them for me. Your grandfather loves opera, doesn't he?" Then, with a shy giggle, she reached into her bag and pulled out a blue plaid tie. She held it up, pretending to measure it around Ethan's neck. "I bought this for you the other day. It suits you perfectly," she murmured, her voice dripping with affection. "Let's save it for our wedding day, shall we?" My grip on the envelope tightened. So, it was true. They were getting married. I should have felt the familiar sting of pain, the jealousy, the desperate urge to interfere. But this time, I felt nothing. Nothing except the certainty that I had made the right choice. Olivia's eyes flickered toward me, her lips twitching into a smirk. "Oh, Emily, I didn't see you there. Ethan, you didn't bring a gift back for her? Do you think she'll be mad at her future aunt?" Her words dripped with mockery, but I didn't flinch. I simply smiled and met her gaze head-on. Ethan sighed, runnin'. A hand through his hair. She's just a kid. Immature. Don't take it to heart. Sooner or later, she'll move out. Move out. My fingers trembled slightly, but I quickly steadied them. Of course. That's all I had ever been, an outsider, a burden they had been forced to take in. My parents had died in service, sacrificing themselves on the battlefield, and General Carter had taken pity on me. But pity was not the same as love. I had spent my whole life mistaking one for the other. Olivia tilted her head, pretending to be concerned. Oh, Emily, don't take what we said too seriously, okay? Ethan still cares about you. It's just that during our last mission, you really went too far. He's still angry. I felt a bitter laugh rising in my throat. In my past life, I had begged Ethan to take me with him on his military assignments, hoping that if I proved my worth, he would finally see me as more than a helpless girl. But he had never once chosen me. Instead, he had chosen her. And now, he was choosing her again. But this time, I wouldn't fight it. This time, I would let him go. Ethan watched as Emily accepted Olivia's old clothes with an unsettling ease. In the past, she would have thrown a tantrum, cried, demanded new dresses. But now, she simply smiled, declined the offer, and said, "Thank you, Uncle Ethan." "Thank you, Olivia. But I'm still a student, and these things don't really suit me. You should keep them for yourselves." Something inside him twisted. He had expected resistance, tears, a fit of jealousy. But there was none of that. Instead, she seemed indifferent. And that, for some reason, unnerved him. When she turned to leave, he found himself speaking before he could stop himself. "Emily." She paused, looking back at him, waiting. His mouth opened, but no words came out. What was he going to say? That he didn't like this change? That something felt wrong? But she only smiled, a small, unreadable curve of her lips. "I'll be in my room if you need me." Then she was gone, leaving him standing there, a strange unease settling in his chest. That night, Olivia and Ethan went out to make final wedding preparations. The house was empty, silent. Emily sat in her room, carefully packing her belongings. It was time to leave. Just as she zipped up her bag, a shadow fell across her doorway. She looked up to see Ethan standing there, his sharp eyes locked onto the thick envelope on her desk. His voice was quiet but firm. "Is that your admission letter from Harvard?" Emily hesitated. Then, with the smoothest of lies, she nodded. "Yes. It arrived yesterday." For the first time in a long while, Ethan smiled. "You should go to the Capitol and tell Grandpa the good news. Olivia and I will be busy with the wedding." Emily exhaled softly. So, he was sending her away himself. How convenient. She nodded. All right. As she turned away, a single thought echoed in her mind. This time, I'm leaving on my own terms. Part 2, Breaking Away. The morning sun barely peeked through the thick curtains as I stood before the mirror, my reflection staring back at me, calm, composed, determined. Today, I would leave this place forever. Ethan was already gone by the time I made my way downstairs. He and Olivia had left early, most likely to meet with their wedding planner. I found it ironic that he hadn't even considered saying goodbye. Not that it mattered. I had no intention of waiting for anyone's farewell. I had spent the night packing only what I needed. Everything else, every piece of clothing, every meaningless trinket from my past life, was left behind. The girl who had once clung to this house, to its people, to Ethan, was gone. As I reached the grand entrance, I glanced back one last time at the mansion I had called home for the past 11 years. The walls held memories, but none I wished to carry with me. With a deep breath, I stepped outside and into the waiting car. Grandfather's Residence Inn. The capital was a 3-hour drive away. I barely spoke to the driver, my fingers tightening around the thick envelope in my lap. The acceptance letter from the Military Medical University, my true path, my escape. He had wanted me to go to Harvard, to live a life of prestige and comfort. But that wasn't what I wanted. Not anymore. I thought of my parents, their sacrifices, their dreams. They had dedicated their lives to something greater, something beyond themselves. That was the life I had chosen, and nothing, not even Ethan Carter, would hold me back. The capital was bustling as we arrived at grandfather's estate, a place far more welcoming than the Carter mansion. General Carter had always treated me with a quiet respect, his watchful eyes carrying a weight of understanding I had never received from Ethan. When I entered his study, he looked up from his desk, his gaze immediately landing on the envelope in my hands. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes darkened slightly. "So, you made your decision," he said, setting his pen down. I nodded, stepping forward. "Yes, I did." There was a long silence before he gestured toward the seat across from him. I sat, waiting, bracing myself for whatever came next. "You knew Ethan wanted you to go to Harvard." His voice was calm, but firm. "I did," I admitted, "but I never wanted that." His eyes narrowed slightly, studying me. "This isn't just about school, is it?" I exhaled slowly, lowering my gaze for a brief moment. "No, it's not." General Carter sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I knew this day would come." He looked down at my letter before returning his gaze to me. "You remind me of your mother. She was stubborn, too." The mention of my mother made my chest tighten. She and my father had given their lives on the battlefield. They had died heroes, but their loss had left me alone, vulnerable. That vulnerability had led me to Ethan, had made me desperate for his attention, his approval. But not anymore. "You're sure about this?" General Carter asked, his voice softer now. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." He studied me for a long moment before nodding. "Then go. Follow your own path." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Thank you." He didn't stop me. He didn't try to force me to reconsider. He simply accepted my decision, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly free. The next few days passed in a blur of preparations. I had thought Ethan wouldn't notice my absence, that he wouldn't care enough to seek me out. But I was wrong. On my last day in the capital, as I was preparing to leave for the university, a familiar military jeep pulled up outside grandfather's estate. My heart clenched, but I kept my expression steady as Ethan stepped out, his presence commanding as always. The moment he saw me, his gaze darkened. Without hesitation, he strode toward me, his voice sharp and accusing. "Emily, what the hell are you doing?" I lifted my chin. "Leaving." His jaw clenched. "You told me you got into Harvard." "I never told you that." His eyes narrowed. "You didn't correct me either." I shrugged. "Does it matter?" He exhaled harshly, running a hand through his hair. You can't just throw your future away like this. My future isn't yours to decide. For a moment. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, in a softer tone, he said, "You don't belong in the military." I let out a bitter laugh. "And you think I belonged in your world? Living under your shadow, waiting for scraps of your attention?" His brows furrowed, as if he hadn't expected that response. "Emily, that's not." "It doesn't matter," I cut him off. "I'm done, Ethan." There was something raw in his eyes then, something almost vulnerable. But I didn't let it sway me. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I held his gaze. "No, Ethan. You will." And with that, I walked past him, leaving him standing there as I stepped into the car. The engine roared to life, and as we drove away, I didn't look back. Because this time, I wasn't running away from something. I was running toward my future. Part 3: A New Path. The train ride to the military medical university was long, but I barely noticed the passing scenery. My mind was too full of memories, of the future, of the weight I had finally shed. The past was behind me, and ahead lay a path I had chosen for myself. As the train slowed to a stop at my destination, I took a deep breath, feeling an unfamiliar lightness in my chest. This was it, the beginning of something new. With my bag slung over my shoulder, I stepped off the train and into a world that no longer revolved around Ethan Carter. The campus of the Military Medical University was vast and orderly, filled with students who moved with purpose. It felt different from the suffocating luxury of the Carter estate. This place had meaning. It was built on discipline, on dedication, on something greater than oneself. And that was exactly what I needed. The dormitory was simple but clean. My roommate, a bright-eyed girl named Lien, greeted me with an enthusiastic smile. "You must be Emily." "Welcome," she said, offering a firm hand. "Shake." "I heard we were getting a new transfer student." I smiled back, appreciating her warmth. "It's nice to meet you." She gestured toward the room. "It's nothing fancy, but we make do. Early mornings, late nights, and a whole lot of studying. Hope you're ready for it." I nodded. I was more than ready. The first few weeks at the university were brutal. The training was rigorous, the coursework demanding. Every day, we were pushed beyond our limits, expected to excel under pressure. But I welcomed the challenge. Every moment I spent learning, every skill I honed, brought me closer to the person I wanted to become. Unlike my past self, who had lived for someone else's validation, I was now doing something purely for myself. I had no one to impress, no expectations to meet except my own. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. Late one evening, as I was reviewing medical texts in the library, my phone buzzed. I hesitated before checking the screen, my breath hitching. When I saw the name flashing across it. Ethan. I stared at it, debating whether to answer. I had left that world behind. I had nothing to say to him. And yet, a small part of me still wondered, why was he calling? Before I could decide, the call ended. A few seconds later, a message appeared. "Ethan, I need to see you." My fingers hovered over the screen before I forced myself to lock my phone and shove it deep into my bag. Whatever he had to say, it no longer mattered. I was done with him. Days passed without further messages from Ethan. I convinced myself that he had finally let go, that he was too preoccupied with his upcoming wedding to concern himself with me anymore. Then, one afternoon, as I was heading to a lecture, I spotted a familiar figure standing near the campus gates. Ethan. Dressed in his military uniform, he stood rigid, his eyes scanning the students as they walked past him. When his gaze finally landed on me, something flickered in his expression. Relief? Frustration? I wasn't sure. My first instinct was to turn away, to pretend I hadn't seen him. But I knew Ethan well enough to know that he wouldn't leave until he had spoken to me. Bracing myself, I walked up to him. "Why are you here?" His jaw tightened. "You never answered my call." I didn't think there was anything left to say. He exhaled sharply, as if trying to steady himself. "Emily. I made a mistake." I felt my stomach twist, but I forced my expression to remain neutral. "You'll have to be more specific." "You've made a lot of mistakes." He flinched slightly, but pressed on. "I should have never let you leave. I was wrong about everything." I shook my head, my voice firm. "No, Ethan. You weren't wrong. You were just honest about how you saw me, an outsider, a responsibility, someone who didn't belong." His eyes darkened. "That's not true." "Isn't it?" I challenged. "You made it perfectly clear that my presence in your life was temporary. And I accepted that." I moved on. He took a step closer, his voice dropping. "What if I don't want you to move on?" I let out a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "That's not your choice to make." Silence stretched between us. The Ethan I had once known, the one I had loved so foolishly, was unraveling before me. For the first time, I saw doubt in his eyes, regret in the lines of his face. But none of it mattered anymore. I had spent too long waiting for him to see me. Now, I saw myself. Lifting my chin, I took a step back. "Goodbye, Ethan." And this time, I meant it. Part 4: The Reckoning. The weeks following my final conversation with Ethan were some of the most fulfilling of my life. I buried myself in my studies, my training, and the friendships I was beginning to form at the Military Medical University. For the first time in years, I felt as though I was living for myself, not in the shadow of someone else's expectations. And yet, fate had a cruel sense of humor. One evening, as I was leaving the training grounds, a hushed whisper spread through the students gathered outside the mess hall. I barely paid attention until Lien grabbed my arm, her expression tense. "Emily, look." I followed her gaze and felt my breath hitch. Ethan was standing at the edge of the campus, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. But he wasn't alone. Olivia stood beside him, her usual polished demeanor intact. But something was different this time. Her eyes weren't filled with dissension or smugness. No, this time, there was something else: desperation. I clenched my fists and forced myself to stay composed as they approached. "Emily," Ethan's voice was controlled, but there was an edge to it. "We need to talk." I crossed my arms, tilting my head slightly. "I thought we already did. And I remember saying goodbye." Ethan's jaw tightened, but it was Olivia who spoke first. "Please, Emily. Just hear us out." The Olivia Jennings I had known would ever have said please to me. That alone piqued my curiosity. Against my better judgment, I nodded, leading them to a quiet spot under a large tree near the edge of campus. "You have 5 minutes." Ethan hesitated before speaking. "Olivia is in trouble." I raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "And what does that have to do with me?" Olivia inhaled sharply, looking down at her hands before finally whispering, "My career, everything I built, it's crumbling. And it's because of something I wrote." My arms tightened across my chest. "You mean that little fabricated story about me? The one that nearly ruined my reputation? Pardon me if I don't feel particularly sympathetic." Ethan pinched the bridge of his nose. "Emily, listen. Olivia was fed false information. She was misled." I let out a dry laugh. "And yet, she never bothered to verify anything before publishing it. A real journalist would have." Olivia's face paled. "I was young. I made a mistake." "You made a career out of ruinin'." "Gee lives," I countered. "Why should I help you?" Ethan exhaled slowly, his frustration evident. "Because someone is trying to destroy her. And if they succeed, you could be next." That caught my attention. I studied Olivia's face carefully. Despite my anger, my gut told me there was more to this than just karma finally catching up to her. "Who?" I asked. Olivia swallowed hard. "I don't know. But whoever it is, they have power. Enough to twist narratives, to make people disappear." A chill ran down my spine, but I kept my expression unreadable. "And what exactly do you expect me to do about it?" Ethan took a step closer. "You know how the media works. You have the training, the connections. You could help us figure out who's behind this." I let out a slow breath, weighing my options. My instincts told me to walk away, to let Olivia deal with the consequences of her own actions. But there was something bigger at play here, something dangerous. And despite everything, I wasn't the type to ignore a threat. I sighed, crossing my arms. "Fine. I'll look into it." Relief flickered in Ethan's eyes, and for the briefest moment, something unfamiliar passed between us. But I ignored it. This wasn't about him. This was about justice. And justice was something I would never turn my back on. Part 5: Redemption and Closure. The investigation into Olivia's downfall was far from simple. The more I dug, the clearer it became that someone was orchestrating her demise with meticulous precision. Every article she had ever written was suddenly under scrutiny. Anonymous sources leaked information about her past dealings, framing her as a corrupt journalist. Her career, her reputation, everything was crumbling. But why? Despite my personal grievances, I couldn't ignore the signs. Saw me on. Powerful was pulling the strings, and if what Ethan had said was true, I could be next. Days turned into weeks as I pieced together the puzzle. Late one evening, while reviewing old articles, I stumbled upon a name that sent chills down my spine: Marcus Langley. A wealthy businessman with extensive media influence, known for his ability to silence those who opposed him. Olivia had written an exposé on him years ago, detailing unethical dealings that had nearly cost him his empire. She had survived his wrath then. But now? He was coming for her with a vengeance. I met Ethan at a secluded cafe near the university. He looked exhausted, as though he had barely slept since this whole ordeal began. "I found something," I said, sliding the folder across the table. Ethan flipped through the pages, his expression darkening with each passing second. "Langley," he muttered. "Damn it." Olivia arrived moments later, her usually pristine appearance marred by stress. She sat down. Without a word, her fingers trembling as she clutched her cup of coffee. "You were right," I told her. "Someone is trying to destroy you." And that someone is Marcus Langley. Her face paled. I thought he had moved on. I shook my head. He's patient. He waited for the right time to strike. And now, he's making sure you'll never work in journalism again. Ethan set the folder aside. We need to expose him before he buries you completely. Olivia looked at me, her eyes pleading. Will you help me? A few months ago, I would have relished in her downfall. But now, I saw a woman who had made mistakes but didn't deserve to be erased by a man like Langley. And if I walked away, what would that say about me? I nodded. Yes. But we do this on my terms. The plan was simple yet dangerous. If Langley wanted to manipulate the media, we would use the same weapon against him. We compiled evidence of his past crimes, gathered testimony, eels from those he had wronged, and worked with independent journalists willing to take the risk. Then, we leaked it all. The backlash was immediate. Headlines exploded with Langley's corruption. Investigations were launched. His empire trembled under the weight of the truth. And Olivia? She wasn't a victim anymore. She reclaimed her voice, went public with her side of the story, and fought back. Weeks later, as the dust settled, I stood by the university gates, staring at the horizon. The chapter involving Ethan and Olivia was finally closing. Ethan approached his hands in his pockets. You didn't have to help her, he said. I shrugged. But I did. He studied me for a long moment. You've changed. I smiled, a genuine one this time. I had to. He hesitated before speaking again. I never deserved your loyalty, Emily. But thank you. This time, I felt no bitterness, no lingering pain, only peace. Goodbye, Ethan, I said. And as I walked away, I knew I was finally free.